Imagine selling 50 million albums, boasting a resume that includes the Beatles and Pink Floyd, and creating the iconic soundtrack for the Chicago Bulls dynasty. Now, imagine walking down the street without a single person recognizing who you are. For the Alan Parsons Project, this was not an accident. It was a calculated design. While the rest of the music world was obsessed with spandex, hairspray, and ego-driven frontmen, this group did the unthinkable. They removed the human face from rock and roll entirely. They refused to tour. They refused to put their photos on album covers. They treated singers like disposable instruments. But what started as a revolutionary experiment in pure audio perfection eventually became a prison. This is the story of how two men predicted the modern world's anxiety, only to fade into the background because of the very rule they created. Why did they hide? And was their silence a stroke of genius, or the reason they are often forgotten? To understand why a band would choose to be invisible, you have to look at where Alan Parsons was standing in the early 1970s. He was not just pressing record buttons, he was arguably the most important set of ears in the entire industry. He was the assistant engineer on the Beatles' Abbey Road and the sonic architect behind Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. But from his vantage point behind the mixing desk, Parsons saw something else entirely. He saw the ugly underbelly of fame. He watched as creative genius was often strangled by massive egos, infighting, and the exhausting demands of being a celebrity. Working with heavyweights like Pink Floyd, he witnessed firsthand how the pressure of maintaining a public image could tear people apart. The music industry at the time was built entirely on the cult of personality, the idea that you needed a charismatic frontman like Mick Jagger or Robert Plant to sell records. Parsons looked at this model and decided it was fundamentally broken. He believed that the production, the soundscape, and the composition were the real art, not the person wearing leather pants on stage. This is where the seed of the project was planted. He wanted to create the musical equivalent of a film director like Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick. In cinema, the director is the visionary, and the actors are just tools used to tell the story. Parsons wanted to apply that same logic to rock music. He did not want a band, he wanted a brand. When he met manager and songwriter Eric Woolfson, they agreed on a radical new strategy. They would not form a group in the traditional sense. There would be no lead singer, no fixed guitarist, and absolutely no drama. They would simply hire the best session musicians in London, record the perfect take, and then send them home. It was an engineer's dream, total control with zero emotional baggage. But as they would soon find out, removing the human element came with a heavy price. The strategy they implemented was unlike anything the music business had ever seen. In a standard rock band, the lead singer's voice is the sonic fingerprint. It is the anchor that tells the listener who they are listening to. But the Alan Parsons Project treated vocalists like instruments that could be swapped out at a moment's notice. If a song required a smoky, melancholic tone, they would call in Colin Blunstone. If they needed a high-energy, aggressive rock delivery, they would bring in Lenny Zakatek. There was no loyalty to a specific frontman, only loyalty to the composition itself. This approach was strictly professional, but for the average listener, it was deeply confusing. Imagine buying an album, loving the first track, and then hearing a completely different person singing the second track. It disoriented the audience. Fans would fall in love with a voice on the radio, run to the record store to buy the album, and then realize that the singer they loved only appeared on one song out of 10. It prevented the public from forming that crucial parasocial bond with the band members. Who were they supposed to hang a poster of on their wall? The sound engineer? Radio disc jockeys often had no idea how to introduce the tracks. They would announce a new song by the Alan Parsons Project, but the voice coming out of the speakers belonged to the lead singer of the Zombies or heavy hitter John Miles. It created a strange paradox where the songs were massive hits, climbing the charts globally, yet nobody knew who the actual people behind the music were. The brand was successful, but the identity was non-existent. While this allowed Parsons and his partner to remain anonymous, it also meant they were inadvertently building a glass ceiling over their own heads. They were creating a library of hits that everyone knew, but a legacy that nobody could visualize. And right in the center of this identity crisis was the man who was actually doing the heavy lifting, a man who was about to become the center of a quiet, brewing storm. While the public was trying to figure out who was singing, a much deeper conflict was simmering inside the studio walls. It was the battle over who actually owned the soul of the band. The project bore the name of Alan Parsons, and because of his pedigree with Pink Floyd, the media naturally assumed he was the mastermind behind every note, but the reality was far more complicated. The true creative engine driving the songwriting was a man named Eric Woolfson. Woolfson was a fascinating figure, a manager by trade, but a composer at heart. In almost any other band, the person writing the lyrics and the melodies is the frontman, but in this unique arrangement, Woolfson was technically the business manager who also happened to write all the hits. For years, he was content to stay in the background, but as the project evolved, a strange tension began to grow. Woolfson would often lay down the guide vocals, rough scratch tracks intended to show the hired session singers how the melody should sound. But on several occasions, including their most enduring tracks, Parsons realized that the professional singers could not capture the raw emotion that Woolfson delivered. This came to a head with their biggest hits, Time and Eye in the Sky. These were sung by Woolfson himself. Imagine the psychological toll this takes on a musician. You write a song that reaches the top 10 on the Billboard charts, you sing the vocals that millions of people are humming in their cars, yet the album cover says the Alan Parsons Project. To the outside world, you are effectively a ghost. Interviews would focus on Parsons' engineering techniques, while the man who poured his heart into the lyrics sat on the sidelines. It created a bizarre dynamic where the star of the band was the technician and the artist was treated like a silent partner. Woolfson was essentially the invisible frontman. He was providing the voice and the words, but receiving almost none of the rock star glory. While they publicly maintained a professional relationship, this imbalance of credit was a ticking bomb. Woolfson was proving that he could be the star they were trying so hard to avoid, and that success challenged the very foundation of their faceless philosophy. And while this internal struggle was happening, the music itself was beginning to take on a darker, almost prophetic tone, one that would predict the future with terrifying accuracy. The Alan Parsons Project wasn't just hiding their faces, they were hiding warnings in their liner notes. In 1977, long before the internet or smartphones existed, they released an album called I, Robot. While it was inspired by Isaac Asimov's famous science fiction stories, the album wasn't just a retelling of a book, it was a sonic prediction of the very crisis we are facing today. The central theme of the record was the rise of the machine and the decline of the human. The opening track features a cold, synthesized voice stating, "The vehicle of man's destruction is his own invention." At the time, listeners thought this was just cool sci-fi storytelling, but fast forward nearly 50 years and that lyric feels less like fiction and more like a headline. They explored the idea of artificial intelligence stepping in to do what humans used to do, asking the uncomfortable question, if machines can think and create, what is left for us? The track, The Voice, loops a hypnotic, robotic chant that suggests we are all being programmed without realizing it. It is terrifyingly accurate. They were writing about algorithms and digital dependence in an era when computers were the size of a room. This wasn't just a pop album, it was a philosophical statement. By removing their own personalities from the band, they became the perfect vessel to tell a story about a world where human identity is erased by technology.
They weren't just making music, they were telling us exactly where society was heading. But they didn't stop at AI. Their next major prediction would tackle something even more invasive, the death of privacy.
If I, Robot was the warning about technology, their 1982 masterpiece, Eye in the Sky, was the warning about control. This is arguably their most famous song, a soft rock staple that plays in grocery stores and doctors' offices around the world. Most people hum along thinking it is a gentle love song about a man watching over his partner, but if you actually listen to the lyrics, the reality is much more sinister. The title Eye in the Sky comes directly from the casino industry. It refers to the hidden cameras in the ceiling that watch every move a gambler makes, searching for cheaters. Eric Woolfson was fascinated by this concept of invisible, constant surveillance. The song is not about protection, it is about an omniscient force that sees everything you do. I can read your mind, I can cheat you blind. These are not the words of a lover, they are the words of a dictator, or perhaps a satellite. The album cover featured the Eye of Horus, an ancient symbol of protection, but in the context of the music, it felt like Big Brother. They were tapping into a paranoia that has become the defining feature of the 21st century. Today, we carry eyes in our pockets. We are tracked by GPS, monitored by algorithms, and watched by security cameras on every street corner. The Alan Parsons Project described a world where privacy is dead and the watcher is always right there with you. It is chilling to realize that a pop song from the early 80s perfectly captured the modern surveillance state. But while they were busy predicting the future of society, they failed to predict the massive shift that was about to happen in the music industry, a shift that would punish them for staying hidden.
The early 1980s brought a seismic shift that the Alan Parsons Project was completely unprepared for, the launch of MTV. Suddenly, music was no longer just about what you heard, it was about what you saw. Bands like Duran Duran and Bon Jovi were exploding, not just because of their songs, but because they were telegenic. They had haircuts, outfits, and charisma that popped off the screen. For a band that had spent a decade purposefully hiding their faces, this was a disaster. When record executives demanded music videos, the project had nothing to film. They couldn't put a charismatic frontman in front of the camera because they didn't have one. Instead, they resorted to abstract animations and surreal imagery. While artistic, these videos failed to build the emotional connection that teenagers were craving. You couldn't fall in love with a cartoon or a rotating pyramid. To make matters worse, they steadfastly refused to tour. In the rock era, the live concert was the church where fans went to worship. It was where loyalty was cemented. By refusing to play live, they denied their audience that communal experience. They remained a studio creation, perfect, polished, but distant. While their albums still sold millions based on audio quality alone, their cultural footprint began to fade. They were competing against artists who were in your living room every hour on television, while they remained ghost stories. This lack of visibility began to erode their commercial power, and the internal cracks between the two founders were about to turn into a chasm. By the late 1980s, the friction between the engineer and the composer had become unsustainable. The breaking point wasn't a fight over money or a scandal involving a groupie. It was a fundamental disagreement over artistic direction. Eric Woolfson, the man who had written the hits, was tired of the strict rock album format. He had fallen in love with the idea of musical theatre. He looked at the songs he was writing and saw them not just as radio singles, but as parts of a grand stage production. He poured his energy into a massive new undertaking called Freudiana, a concept album based on the life and work of Sigmund Freud. It was originally intended to be the 11th Alan Parsons Project album, but Woolfson pushed it to become a full-blown Austrian stage musical. Alan Parsons, on the other hand, had absolutely no interest in Broadway or the West End. He was a rock producer, a master of the recording studio, and he wanted to continue making records that fit the brand they had built over the last decade. The divergence was absolute. Woolfson wanted the stage, Parsons wanted the studio. There was no shouting match, no press conference, and no dramatic headlines in the tabloids. In true Alan Parsons Project fashion, the end was as understated as their beginning. Woolfson took the Freudiana material and walked away to pursue his new career in theatre, leaving Parsons to carry on the name alone. The partnership that had quietly sold 50 million albums simply dissolved into the ether. They didn't burn out, they just faded away, leaving behind a discography that was perfect, polished, and ultimately finished. The Alan Parsons Project was the original faceless band. Long before Daft Punk put on helmets or gorillas hid behind cartoons, Parsons and Woolfson proved that you do not need a celebrity image to conquer the world. You just need an idea. They sacrificed their personal fame for the sake of the music, creating a legacy that is pure, untainted by tabloid gossip, and almost entirely about the sound. In a modern world obsessed with influencers, selfies, and constant visibility, their refusal to play the game feels more revolutionary now than it did 40 years ago. They bet on the art outlasting the artist, and looking back, they were right. What do you think? Was their anonymity a stroke of genius, or did it rob them of the credit they deserved? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into music history, hit that like button and subscribe to Retro Celeb Talk for more stories about the legends you thought you knew. Thanks for watching.